our inability to grow food to feed the 7+ billion people on the planet right now, the disappearing of vital resources like fresh water and food, the inevitable collapse of the global economy. 2005, they knew it was coming because the systems that were in place at that time were unsustainable systems. And this is what we're seeing when we look at the world and the things that are changing. For many people, it looks like everything's coming apart at the seams.
Right.
If we look closely, what we see is the only things coming apart are the unsustainable ways of living based on unsustainable ways of thinking. And the new discoveries now are telling us where we can shift and giving us very good reasons to make those changes.
Well, in fact, this is really no surprise. And as you have learned, and you're going to tell us about today, that this is a repeated cycle in history.
It is. And I was trained as a scientist, Lisa, and I think science is good. Science doesn't have all the answers. But my scientific mind was asking the question, why now? Why would all these changes be happening right now? And what we're beginning to understand is that many of the changes are actually triggered by Earth's location in space. It's things like the tilt and the wobble and the angle and the orbit. Earth is a very dynamic body in the heavens. It doesn't just rotate to create night and day and tilt for the seasons. There's a lot more going on. But some of the cycles that define these things cover such vast periods of time. No one in our time remembers the last time that it happened. And this is where our ancient and indigenous traditions are so valuable, because they have perpetuated the story of these changes. So our own science now is in fact telling us the changes are upon us. Interestingly, they parallel many of the traditions of our most cherished and ancient indigenous traditions.
Which we'd love to learn about.
Yeah, well, some of those, I think we've all heard of native traditions that talk about changes, and many of those are from native cultures that are close to the earth. So they talk about when a white buffalo is born in the plains of North America, or when the crops no longer grow in their season. And for scientists, that's not very scientific. But we like the Maya a lot, because the Maya thought a lot the way we think. The Maya talked about cycles of time based in astronomical events and celestial cycles that we can confirm on our computers today. So they are talking a language of mathematics that we understand. And what the Maya told us, if you're looking at your screen right now, the Maya told us about cycles of time. Many people believe that the image on the screen is the Mayan calendar, and it is not. I want to be very clear about that. This is the Aztec calendar that is based on Mayan ideas, but there is no single artifact that represents all the different ways that the Maya were able to track time. But what we're seeing on the Aztec calendar, the 4 boxes that you see highlighted in your screen represent 4 cycles of time in the past that parallel the cycles that we're having now. What they said is every 5,125 years we go through a big change. It is called a great world age, and that we are nearing the end of a great world age. It's not the end of the world, it's the end of a world age.
How did they know that?
You know, how did they know without computers, GPS, and satellites? So that's one of the great mysteries.
Archaeological digs.
We could do a whole program on that, and there's some very good theories that we're going to talk about as we go through our program. The fact is, they did understand cycles in their time that we're only beginning to understand in ours, and they told us in the language of their time, a language that's only now beginning to make sense. Excuse me. So they told us about 4 cycles in the past, 5,125 years long, and they told us that we are living the 5th and final in a series of 5 of these cycles. We're living this cycle right now, and that this cycle would end in our lifetime, that this cycle began with a rare astronomical event, August 11th, 3114 BC. This is the biblical era. Interestingly, it's when so many of our spiritual traditions were created to help people deal with the changes in their lives then, very similar to what we're living right now.
So religion and those types of contexts happen because of the confusion that was happening at that time.
At least they happened at the same time. What we can say is in response to what was happening. So the cycle began August 11, 3114 BC. They told us that this cycle would end precisely 1,872,000 days later. That is 5,125 years later, with another rare astronomical event that occurs on the winter solstice, December 21st of the year 2012. So this is where this date comes from. It's not a date that just is made up or comes, from just pulled out of the air.
From movies.
It's linked. It is linked directly to astronomical cycles that we can confirm today.
But over time, the addiction to those emotions connect to people and problems in their life. So they use the people and problems in their life to reaffirm an addiction to some emotion that they don't even know that they have. And if they don't like their life, they become addicted to the life they don't even like. And so just like an addict that's addicted to some substance, when you have to break that addiction, of course, there's withdrawals, and you start having images and cravings. And that's exactly what the brain does when it's going through an emotional withdrawal. So if a person has a trauma in their life and it brands them emotionally, the moment we feel a change in our internal chemistry, we pay attention to what causes it in our external environment, and the brain takes a snapshot, and that's called a memory. The higher the emotional quotient, the stronger the long-term memory. So there's nothing wrong with that, except that when we're in survival and we're living in stress, we tend to anticipate that scenario happening again. And we actually plan for it unconsciously. And we begin to select a future potential. And we begin to emotionally embrace that outcome. Now here's the challenge. When you combine a thought with an emotion, you're creating a state of being. Because thoughts are the vocabulary of the brain and feelings are the vocabulary of your body. And how you think and how you feel creates your state of being. So the combination of selecting the worst case scenario in your life and emotionally embracing it is turning on the stress response just by thought alone. Now, when you turn on the stress response and you can't turn it off, now you're headed for disease, because no organism can live in emergency mode for extended periods of time. If you're tapping the body's resources for some external threat for the short term, that's great. When the stress is over, the body returns back to homeostasis, and of course the body builds its resources again. But if you keep turning on that stress response and you can't turn it off, and you're mobilizing all this energy for some threat in your external environment, there's no energy in your internal environment for growth and repair. There's no energy for long-term building projects. It's like there's a war out there, and you're sending all the troops out, and there's no homeland security. So as stress hormones go up, immune function goes down. It's a fact. And when that happens, melatonin levels go down, of course, which means you're not going to want to sleep, because if there's a predator out there, why would you be vulnerable in the middle of the night? You got to stay awake. So the survival gene switches on, and we get in trouble. And so if it's not a predator that's in the cave or outside the cave waiting for you, which was highly adaptive thousands of years ago, but what if it's your coworker that's sitting at the cubicle next to you who you resent and despise? Well, that primitive nervous system that was once adaptive is now very maladaptive. But if we can turn on the stress response just by thought alone, then as we begin to select that future worst case scenario, and by the way, we'll even go, well, let's make it worse. Well, what if this happens? What if that happens? And we start to develop this model. And as we hold that image in our mind, the body as the unconscious mind is beginning to believe it's living in that future reality in the present moment.
So the simple point is, you want to know your programming? Look at your life. As I said, the things you like that come are there because you have programs to support them. But in contrast, anything you must work at, anything you have to put effort into to manifest in your life, the amount of work you're putting in is really to compensate for the fact that you have a program that doesn't support. The conscious mind is the driver. That's who you are. That's your identity, your source, your spirit. And why it becomes relevant is that the conscious mind, when driving the vehicle, controls where that body vehicle is going to go. But when the conscious mind is thinking, then the default control, the autopilot, steps in, which is called the subconscious. I mean, the simple point is this. I asked you a simple question. I say, what are you doing on Monday at 2 o'clock? If you actually try to answer that question, you have to go inside. I say, oh, if the conscious mind's going inside to answer the question, then who's controlling where you are outside? If you're walking down the street and you're thinking, doesn't mean you stop until the thought is complete. You're still walking. If you're driving the car and you're thinking, you're still driving the car. Point. When the conscious mind is busy thinking 95% of the day, which is science's recognition, That means 95% of the day, your program is being run by autopilot, default, subconscious programming. Problem, the subconscious programs primarily came from other people. So it says 5% of the day you are controlling your biology to go toward your destination, wherever you want. 95% of the day you're in thought. So the autopilot subconscious is working 95% of the day, but those represent the programs downloaded from other people. The conclusion is simple. You're only controlling your life about 5% of the time. 95% is coming from the program. As psychologists recognize, the vast majority of these programs are self-sabotaging, disempowering, and limiting, the programs that we get. And why this becomes relevant, if 95% of your life is coming from those programs, no wonder we have to struggle to get through our